There is a city underneath Chicago, not a basement level, not a maintenance corridor. A city with storefronts whose doors still have handles, with windows positioned at what should be ceiling height, with decorated facades facing streets that disappeared from the surface more than a century ago. The official story says this happened because of a decision in the 1850s and 1860s to raise the entire city above the mud. That story is documented. That story is taught. And that story leaves open a set of questions that the documentation does not answer. Walk down Lake Street in Chicago today and you are walking on top of something. The ground beneath your feet is not natural earth. It is not the original grade of the land. It is a constructed surface laid over a previous city that did not simply cease to exist when the new one was built above it. The original commercial storefronts are still down there. Their facades face streets that are now sealed. Their windows, which once looked out onto one of the most aggressively growing commercial corridors in North America, now look out onto nothing. Brick corridors and sealed passages that utility workers and the occasional researcher with proper access occasionally move through beneath the modern city above. The official explanation is contained in a fairly short paragraph in most Chicago history books. The city was built on swampy, low-lying land at the southern tip of Lake Michigan. The streets flooded constantly, sewage could not drain, disease was endemic. Beginning in the late 1850s, the city undertook an engineering project of astonishing ambition. They raised the entire city. Buildings were physically lifted using jack screws, while new foundations were constructed beneath them. Streets were filled and regraded. The whole urban surface was elevated by 4 to 14 feet, depending on the location. The original ground floors became basements. The original street level became the subsurface. And the city that had existed at the original grade simply dropped below the new Chicago being built above it. This is the official story. It is documented. It is celebrated as one of the great engineering achievements of 19th century America. And before we go any further, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from right now, and if you are new here, subscribe, because what comes next is where the official story starts to develop its cracks. The first question is physical. Chicago was incorporated as a town in 1833 and as a city in 1837. The street raising project began in earnest around 1858. That is 21 years. From incorporation to the beginning of the most ambitious urban engineering project in American history to that point. In those 21 years, Chicago grew from a small trading post at the mouth of the Chicago River into a city with tens of thousands of residents and a substantial commercial and residential built environment. The speed of that growth is documented and is genuinely extraordinary by any standard. But the street raising operation itself represents a level of organized municipal engineering capacity that deserves more scrutiny than the celebration it typically receives. To lift an entire city block using jack screws simultaneously requires precise coordination, significant engineering knowledge, substantial labor, and the kind of logistical capacity that most 19th century American cities did not possess. Chicago in 1858 had been a city for 21 years. Some of that is plausible. But when you look at the physical evidence of what was left behind beneath the raised surface, the questions become more specific and more difficult to answer. When you access the spaces below the Chicago street level today, not the tourist-oriented portions, but the actual surviving subsurface architecture in areas where original structures remain, you notice things. The construction is not the rough, improvised building of a rapidly expanding frontier commercial district. The brick courses are regular. The arches are properly constructed. The proportions of the spaces suggest considered architectural planning rather than emergency construction put up fast to meet the demands of a city growing faster than its builders could think. This is the architecture of an established urban tradition. It is the physical character of a place that has been building for longer than the official founding date would suggest. Compare this with other American cities that grew rapidly in the same period. Cleveland, established as a city in 1836, 1 year before Chicago, produced a commercial district in its first 2 decades that was substantial but clearly reflected the constraints of rapid frontier development. Cincinnati, older and more established, showed the gradual development of architectural sophistication over time in a way that matched its documented history. The subsurface Chicago, by contrast, shows a level of architectural maturity that does not map comfortably onto 21 years of development from a trading post. The second question is documentary. If the street raising project was the organized municipal undertaking that the official history describes, the documentation should be extensive. Engineering surveys, municipal contracts, newspaper coverage of the project as it proceeded block by block, property records showing the formal transition of original ground floors to basement designation as the new grade was established above them. Some of this documentation exists. The lifting of the Tremont House Hotel in 1861 using 600 jack screws operated by a crew of 600 men under the direction of George Pullman is documented in multiple sources and is one of the celebrated stories of 19th century American engineering. This is real. This happened. But the engineering documentation for the overall project, the surveys of the original grade across the full urban area, the systematic plans for the fill operation across multiple wards, the contracts with the firms that carried out the work at the scale of an entire city is significantly thinner than you would expect for a project of this magnitude conducted by an established municipal government with a functioning record-keeping apparatus. Alternative historians who have examined the Chicago subsurface make a specific argument about this thinness. Their argument is not that documents were deliberately destroyed. Their argument is more fundamental. The documentation is thin because the street-raising explanation is a retroactive account applied to a situation that was not entirely the product of deliberate street-raising. In this reading, the lower Chicago was not built first and then buried by an engineering project. Some portion of what is now below grade was already below grade when the surface Chicago was being constructed above it. The city underneath was not simply the precursor to the city above. It was a different layer, already buried, already sealed, that the 19th century city encountered and incorporated into its expanding footprint without being able to fully account for what it had found. This is the extraordinary claim, and it requires the extraordinary mechanism that the Tartaria framework provides. In the Tartaria hypothesis, a global civilization of significant urban and architectural sophistication existed before the period recorded in conventional Western history. That civilization was buried or destroyed by a catastrophic event involving massive flooding and rapid sediment deposition. The survivors, or the populations that moved into the affected regions afterward, encountered the physical remnants of that prior civilization and explained them as best they could with the narratives available. In Chicago's case, a city that was already partially subterranean when settlers arrived in the early 19th century, offered a ready explanation when the drainage and flooding problems demanded a solution. We raised the streets. The prior structures were already there. The raising project was real. The question is whether it was raising streets or whether it was building new streets above a surface that was already buried. The flooding itself is worth examining in this context. Chicago's drainage problem was genuine and is well documented. The city was built on flat land with almost no natural grade, meaning water had nowhere to go. This is the documented reason for the street raising project. But the Tartaria reading of this situation asks a different question. Was the flooding problem a natural consequence of the geography, or was it a residual consequence of the same catastrophic event that buried the prior civilization? Was Chicago built on flat, swampy land because that land had been recently deposited over a previous urban surface? Was the drainage problem not a geographic accident but a geological consequence of recent sediment deposition over existing structures? This cannot be resolved by the available documentation because the available documentation is precisely what is being questioned. But the physical evidence continues to sit below Lake Street and Wacker Drive and the other streets of downtown Chicago, and it continues to show a level of architectural sophistication that the official founding narrative does not comfortably explain. The economic dimensions of this story operate in the same way they operate in every city with a documented underground. The subsurface spaces in Chicago serve various functions today, from utility infrastructure to the famous freight tunnels that were secretly expanded in the early 20th century and then flooded in 1992 when a contractor accidentally breached the wall of the Chicago River into the tunnel system. That flooding, known as the Great Chicago Flood, was not a small event. It forced the evacuation of most of downtown Chicago and caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. It also revealed to most Chicagoans for the first time that there was an extensive tunnel system beneath the city that most of them had never heard of. The tunnels were originally constructed between 1899 and 1906 for telephone cables and later expanded for freight. That is the official explanation. The extent of the tunnels, their engineering sophistication, and the secrecy of their later expansion phases are part of a separate set of questions that the official history has also not fully resolved. The practical implication of examining Chicago's subsurface, honestly, is the same implication that the Denver Underground raises. It is an epistemological question. It is a question about how we know what we know about the origins of American cities, and specifically about what was at these locations before the founding dates recorded in the official historical record. The physical evidence is the evidence that does not depend on the documentary record to exist. It is there. The architecture is there. The proportions and the craftsmanship and the scale of the subsurface spaces are there regardless of what the municipal records say about when they were built and why they ended up below ground. The streets of Chicago run above something. The foundations of the elevated city rest on a layer that was already there when the elevation project began. The doors of the lower city are still down there, The window frames are still set in walls that face streets no one has walked in over a century. Drop a comment right now, tell me where you are watching from. It takes 2 seconds, and I want to know how far this is reaching. The explanation for what is down there is still incomplete. The official story is plausible and partially documented, and it does not fully account for what the physical evidence shows. Something was at the location of Chicago before the official founding. Something was built there with the craft and the scale of an established urban tradition. The mud came up over it, or the streets were raised above it, or both things happened in a sequence that the surviving records do not clearly describe. And it is still down there, beneath the elevated surface of one of the great American cities, waiting for a question that the official history has not yet been asked to answer directly.